We are quickly coming to the end of this famous teaching of Jesus, often called the Sermon on the Mount. And today we are tasked with Jesus' famous statement, "Do not judge others." And a couple of questions that kind of want to guide us as we go along is, what does he mean by judge? And is he telling us the truth, that we're not supposed to judge other people? And of course, the answer is yes, he's telling us the truth, but it's deeply nuanced as always. And so, as we dive into the text this morning, I want us to hear it for all it's worth, not just for simple platitudes that we sometimes jump to. Oh, we shouldn't judge other people. Well, that's right, but what does that mean for us? So, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to Matthew chapter 7. We'll have it on the screen as well. We're going to read the first 12 verses together. Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you," or standard, right? The standard you use will be used to you. "Why do you look at the speck of dust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you'll find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." The word of God for the people of God. All right. Jesus very clearly here says, do not judge. Remember all our special grammar talk last week about the subjunctive mood? All out the window here. This is imperative, right? This is a direct command. There's no nuancing that. Do not judge. That's the end-all, be-all. But the question is, what does the word judge mean? Because in our language, the word judge can be used a whole bunch of ways. And it's very easy for us sometimes to say, oh, we shouldn't judge, and therefore, well, unless we really understand what it means, we're going to, I think, miss the heart of what Jesus is after here. So, the word judge in the original language is the word krino. It means, at some very literal level, to act like a judge, right? So, in essence, to give a final verdict, to speak final truth, or more specifically, to condemn, or to use final language like I think Jesus intends, to damn someone. Does it make sense? This is the language we're using here. It's not just making a call on something. It's speaking a final word of judgment over something. It's speaking a word of condemnation over something or over someone. And very clearly Jesus says, my people, we don't do this ever. Well, why? Why don't we do this? Jesus gives us inherently in this text a couple of reasons for this, and they should all be somewhat obvious to us. The first, though not spoken out loud, is what is implied loud and clear. That is that you do not do this, I do not do this. The Pharisees, who Jesus is very clearly speaking to here, you remember that a big part of this Sermon on the Mount, remember, unless you have a righteousness that is greater than the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So the scribes and the Pharisees were the religious leaders of the days of Jesus, and everyone looked to them as perfection in spiritual terms. And they often acted in condemnation over lots of people. And Jesus is saying, hey, you've actually missed the boat here. Because condemnation is an act that is left to God alone. Right? So to condemn, to krino, in this particular passage here, is to take on the role of God instead of being a fellow human being alongside someone. Does this make sense? And Jesus is saying only one person gets to play that part, and it's God himself. He gives us two more reasons then. He says, listen, if you judge this way, then you will be judged the very same way. And again, he's speaking directly to the Pharisees. It's challenging for us on the other side of the cross and the resurrection to make sense of this statement here. But you have to remember, Jesus is speaking it before the cross and the resurrection. And he's speaking it largely to a group of people who believe, either personally about themselves or collectively about a group of people, that they had arrived at some kind of spiritual reality, and that based on their conduct, they could be welcomed by God. And in fact, their morality, their religious practice would be the very thing that would bring God's presence back to the people. Does this make sense? At some level, that should not make sense to you because we preach against that every single week here, right? But this is what the Pharisees believed. And so Jesus is saying, hey, listen, if you want to come at your fellow human beings from an exacting, fierce, rigid form of condemnation and judgment, that's the very thing you're going to get from God. In other words, your righteousness is not good enough. Does it make sense? And so in the very same way that you are picking out from people's actions, God himself, how much more, can look deeply into the heart and speak words of condemnation, right? The whole sermon to this point has been saying, yeah, you don't do this externally, but what's going on in your heart? And so Jesus is asking the group of people, in essence, how would you like God to judge you? How you act towards other people informs the state of your heart about what you think of yourself and how you might stand up to divine judgment. Moreover, the problem that's going on in the religious leaders is that they are what we would call self-righteous, right? Their righteousness is not from God or from Jesus. It's from their own accord. They've built up a spiritual resume. And Jesus is necessarily intending to pop that balloon and say, actually, your self-righteousness, when it comes under the microscope of divine judgment, is actually going to be found massively wanting. And then the third reason Jesus says we should never judge others is because, quite frankly, we lack objectivity, right? Some of us believe we're super objective when it comes to other people's lives. Jesus is here to tell you, you lack any form of objectivity of what's going on in other people's lives. This is why he uses the expression, you find the speck in someone else's eye, but you do nothing about the log in your own eye. Why? Because you lack objectivity about the sin problem of humanity. You just see something someone else did and deem it wrong. Well, Jesus is asking the really important question, could it be possible that your obstructed view is actually causing you to judge wrongly? Fascinating, isn't it? That is that you, at some very deep and inherently clear level, lack the objectivity necessary to bring the final word on something. That is a God thing, not a you and me thing. Now, I don't think that I've opened any new ideas for you this morning, right? You're like, okay, don't judge anyone, don't condemn anyone. Those three reasons make a whole lot of sense. Good. What we really have to wrestle with is the rest of the New Testament, which regularly is telling us that we ought to be involved in the lives of other people, helping them follow God. So how do we juxtapose that to what Jesus is saying here? And I would suggest to you that krino, or judging, in the sense that Jesus uses it here, is very different from what the rest of the New Testament says. And when I say the rest of the New Testament, I'm talking about Jesus has a lot more to say beyond this too, right? So he says this stuff too. So could we just agree, and you might not agree, but I'm asking, could we agree to take the word judge and throw it aside? And instead insert the word condemn, right? Do not condemn. But I would suggest to you that Jesus does call us, and the rest of the New Testament do call us to discern, right? Well, to discern could be to judge. To condemn could be to judge. So let's get our language right. Do not condemn, but do discern. Do discern. Think about it with me for a minute. All throughout the whole Scriptures, God is telling his people that they need to know the difference between right and wrong. Right? We can't get away from that. We can find it all through the Old Testament. The prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 5 says, "Woe to the person who does not know the difference between right and wrong." There's some level of judgment in that, isn't there? There is clear discernment there. Or the writer to Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 5 says, listen, the person who is growing in maturity is increasingly able to differentiate between right and wrong. We are very clearly called to be able to discern between what is right and what is wrong, between what is good and what is evil. But here's what's more, friends. We're called to discern that not just internally, but in relationship with and for the good of our brothers and sisters in the faith. And we need go nowhere else than the words of Jesus himself, a handful of chapters later in this very same Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus pretty famously says in Matthew chapter 18, if your brother or sister sins against you, go to them and point out their fault. That would seem to be at some level in clear contradiction with Matthew chapter 7, wouldn't it? Of course not. Just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. So we are called not to condemn, but we all are called to discern between right and wrong, between good and evil, for ourselves and for our brothers and sisters in the faith, which necessarily means, according to Jesus in Matthew 18, if we take him at his words, going to them and telling them about it. Many people hear Matthew chapter 7 and say, oh, do not judge, and therefore I'm all out. Jesus said, don't judge. I'm just going to live my own life, and you do your own thing. Well, that can't be what Jesus means because he doesn't contradict himself. So somehow these ideas are different. Let's think about the differences together for just a couple of moments. The move to condemn is almost always, in human terms, a move to elevate self over against someone else. It is a prideful act, whereas what Jesus is talking about here is a humble act. A willingness to take a deep breath and do a hard thing and go to someone for their own good and speak truth to them. You want to know the difference between condemnation and discernment for the good of someone else? Ask yourself in that moment, what is driving me? Pride or care? Humble care. Am I seeing this and harping on this in this other person because it proves that I'm better than them? Self-righteousness, haughtiness? Or is my heart moved for the good of my brother and sister in order to push me into that reality? It's pride and it's humility. But it's also the end result, is it not? The end result of condemnation. The final result is if you move in condemnation, what you end up doing is alienating, isolating, and ostracizing. That's the whole reason you're doing it, to make someone other. You're in, but they're not. But if you're moving in discernment towards another person, you're trying to help them walk side by side with you towards God in the way of Jesus for the glory of God. Does this make sense? Now here's what I want to tell you. If any of that doesn't make sense, or if you're wrestling with in a moment, what am I supposed to do here? Look nowhere else other than to the example of Jesus himself. What Jesus is suggesting to us here is very much a gospel-centered posture. Surprise, surprise. John chapter 3, verse 16. Everyone knows that verse, right? Even if this is the first time in church, you're like, I think that's an important verse. I've heard people talk about it somewhere, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that anyone who believes in him should not die, but will have eternal life forever and ever, right? Incredible. The very next verse is just as important. John chapter 3, verse 17, where it says that Jesus did not come into the world to condemn it, but to rescue it. Why is it that Jesus can say hard things to people at times, and yet people are willing to embrace him? Because he never has the spirit of condemnation. It is God's job, right? God the Father's job, God's job to bring condemnation. But when Jesus enters into humanity, right? He said, Philippians chapter 2, unwilling to firmly hold on to his divine qualities, right? So he sets aside at some level that divine right to condemn, and instead takes a human posture that is meant to bring people to salvation for the glory of God. We're about to enter the Advent season. The Advent season is all about Jesus coming near to you and me to very gently remind us that we are broken, that we are on the wrong pathway, that something is off, that we're in need of restoration, and offering us a very path towards restoration. So would it not then be wholly appropriate for Jesus to say to his followers and his people, in the very same way, interact with those who are around you? Are they worthy of condemnation? Perhaps. Are you worthy of condemnation? Certainly. Right? This is what Jesus is wanting us to process and remember. Is the issue that person doesn't have a speck in their eye? No. And quite frankly, it probably is bigger than a speck. But Jesus' point is, if you're not regularly returning to your own brokenness and being led back into restoration by Jesus himself, you'll have no means by which to engage your fellow brother or sister. Does this make sense? So Jesus is calling us to a whole different posture, a whole different way that says, yeah, you know what? I am not an agent of condemnation. However, as salt and light that Jesus is calling me to be, I am necessarily called into these relationships for the good of my brother and sister and for the glory of God. So let's go back to the text and let's read it a second time. In light of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, even though the first hearers wouldn't have had that reality in front of them, And let's see if we can't even glean more understanding of what's happening here. So, first and foremost, Jesus says, do not judge. We can't change anything about that, nor would we want to, right? That stands as it is. God is the judge. You are not the judge. You are not the person who is meant to speak the final word over anybody. You are not the one that is to tell anyone what their ultimate destination is. You're not the one who has the authority to damn somebody or to utter words of condemnation. Ever. However, based on all of Jesus' other teaching, we do believe that we have a role to play in each other's lives. So, Jesus says, don't remove the speck from your brother's eye, look at the plank in your own eye. I think it would be appropriate for us to read this and say, you should see the speck in your brother's eye. All too often we read this and we think, oh, don't even see that, right? No, Jesus is saying you have no ability to deal with it, but you can see it. Could it be that Jesus is saying, hey, when you see the speck in your brother or sister's eye, your very first inclination should turn inward to examine your own proverbial eye. Of course, the eye would be the heart, right? Jesus has been using this eye language with heart language, strange first century analogies all throughout. Is that you see your brother or your sister wrestling through choices, maybe making wrong choices, maybe living in wrong patterns, and it should at the very initial beginning turn you inward to ask yourself hard questions about the state of your own heart. It should instantaneously, very first, remind you that yes, you too have a whole lot in common with that broken person. And unless and until you are dealing with your own brokenness, the process stops there. But according to Matthew chapter 18, Jesus would say, hey, if possible, go to your brother or sister with the speck in their eye and discern with them. Now, let me give you a couple of caveats about this, right? I'm going to say if, where, and when appropriate, right? So let's talk that through, right? Because some people like, go to your brother. Nope, I would never do that. Not going to happen. Other people are like, yeah, I could do that, right? Either of those situations, you should be like, I better think this stuff through. If, where, and when appropriate. If is appropriate, right? Here's the thing. You should constantly be looking at and be immersed in the ministry of Jesus. So we have these Gospels not just because at the end of the story Jesus dies and raises again. Of course, that's the most important part, right? That's why we have hope. But Jesus comes and lives an earthly life because he's showing us what the gospel lived out looks like in human terms. And so we can look at the life of Jesus and say, Jesus let a whole lot of things slide, didn't he? In other words, Jesus' job was not to be the behavior police. And if that was the case, far be it from us to think that we are going to be the behavior police in this community of faith. Now, Jesus definitely asserted himself and spoke truth to people at important times in important ways. So don't mishear me, but we're not looking around, right? We don't show up on Sunday to see who's going to misstep today so that I can go to them and at that point you have no opportunity to even go to them in humility because you've already shown your true colors. So we're talking here about ongoing missteps. We're talking about people who are walking off a path in progressive ways. We're talking about people who are causing harm and damage to other people. We're talking about habitual things. We're talking about actions or steps that could have colossal damage. We're not talking about someone came in and was frustrated and lashed out at their kid, right? Should they do that? Of course not. If they're doing that every week, probably they need to be talked to. I guess so, right? But one Sunday that happens, we're not the behavior police here. And so if, when, and where appropriate, we're asking ourselves, what is the action? But we're also asking ourselves, what is our motive? Right? Are we going to point out wrong? That would not be a good motive. If we're going in order to restore, then it would be completely appropriate for us to engage. And then, what is in our heart? Is it a prideful thing? Or is it a humble, loving thing? Can I just be honest with us for just a minute? Most of us hear the word love and think, well, love would not do that. And I want to suggest to you a couple of things. Sometimes love would not do that. Oftentimes, love, in fact, would do that. Oftentimes, when we refrain from speaking humbly, restoratively, and truthfully to our brother and sister, we are acting in unlove towards them. Because we're not helping them see a path of restoration and a path of truth. And then when we talk about when and where, of course, we're talking about Jesus' language in Matthew 18. We're talking about going to them, right? We're not talking about public announcements. We're not talking about isolation or ostracization. We're not talking about doing it in front of other people. We're talking about in a very humble, restorative environment, engaging someone. And I would suggest to you, Jesus says, listen, you are not able to remove the speck from someone else's eye unless and until the plank has been removed from your eye. Let's follow that to the nth degree. When will the plank be removed from your eye? Well, we believe, theologically speaking, the plank will be removed from our eye when Jesus returns and makes all things new. So, can I humbly, restoratively, graciously, discerningly come alongside of you and tell you that the plank is not yet removed from your eye? And therefore, based on Jesus' teaching, you are incapable of removing the speck from your brother or sister's eye. However, that does not mean you are incapable from helping them discern it in their own eye. But the idea is when we humbly come to someone and discern alongside of them, right, which means asking them helpful questions, not making assumptions, whatever, our whole idea in moving them towards restoration is actually pointing them to Jesus, not our self-help for them. Right? Well, I had that problem, and here's what I did. But what would it actually mean to come alongside someone and point them to Jesus, the one who actually is able to do the work? Now think about the analogy for just a second, right? If you had and again, the word speck is probably an over translation. The word probably is more like stick versus log, right? It's not meant to be this teeny little thing. You've got this thing jammed in your eyeball, right? Whatever it is. Who do you want surgically removing that thing from your eye? Dude with an even bigger thing sticking out of their eye, which they need to see, right? Jesus is like, you actually need God not just to be the condemner, but also to be the restorer. Isn't this a beautiful story? That the only one who actually has the authority to condemn is also the only one who has the ability to restore. So what is our job? Not only to refrain from condemning, but to point people towards the same God who intends and desires to restore them. This is what salt and light behavior looks like. Now, Jesus from that point gets a little weird, doesn't he? He's like, hey, listen, don't put the sacred stuff to the dogs and don't throw the pearls to the swine. We're like, what? Planks and eyeballs and logs and eyes, and now we're throwing pearls to pigs? This is weird stuff, right? And quite frankly, it is super weird. But again, we have to get into a first century mindset to understand what he's talking about. So your beloved pet dog, if you have one, I have one who I love to death, right? In the first century world, people didn't have pet dogs. Dogs were scavengers, and they were around, and they were considered dangerous and unclean. Even more so as a first century Jewish person, the most unclean thing you could think about would be a pig, for all kinds of reasons. And so Jewish people came to start talking about non-Jewish people as dogs and pigs, right? And so Jesus is, he's Jesus, right? So we have to give him the benefit of the doubt, if that's the right way to say it. We have to understand pure motives here. He's not making a derogatory statement about people. He's using the Pharisees' language in order to punch back at them, if that makes sense, right? And so he's saying, hey, listen, don't give the sacred stuff to the non-sacred people. So let's move this to language of 2024. What would it mean to not give the sacred stuff to non-sacred people? What Jesus, I think, is somewhat clearly saying here is that, hey, listen, people who aren't in a covenant relationship with God, you ought not expect them to live as if they were. Right? They're living according to their own appetite for identity, their own appetite for significance, for acceptance, whatever might be driving them. And so you can toss moral platitudes at them, or self-righteousness at them, or condemnation at them, and they will do one of two things to it. They'll either trample it as if it's meaningless, or they will attack you. But in the very same way, Jesus, I think, is also calling us, you and me, hopefully non-Pharisaical types, to discern. Is that we are not only meant to discern good from evil, right from wrong, and not only meant to discern it alongside our brothers and sisters, but we equally are meant to be people who can discern where people are in their spiritual journeys, and therefore understand appropriate ways to speak to them about the situations and scenarios in their lives. A little bit later on, Jesus will tell a parable of the pearl of greatest price. What is it? It's the gospel, right? And so for us, as salt and light people, as Jesus followers, as people who are trying to help people, trying to point them towards restoration, first and foremost, we should not expect of non-believers, non-followers of Jesus, a desire in them to live the Jesus way. That should never surprise us. And we ought never attempt to force it on them. Jesus even here says it could have catastrophic consequences. Now, I'm not telling you that we shouldn't seek societal good in what we're doing. Don't mishear me. I'm talking about in your personal interactions with individuals. In the very same way, we ought to have the ability to speak the gospel to people in ways that meet them where they are and on the basis of their understanding, discerning where they are in their spiritual journeys, and helpfully in that moment, in that place, in that way, pointing them towards God as restorer rather than me and you as condemner. What would that look like in the various people in your spheres of influence? Quite frankly, friends, and hopefully I'm not saying anything that's somewhat surprising to you. And even together as we sit here in a church service or a worship gathering on Sunday, just because we're present here doesn't mean we're not all at different places in our spiritual journeys. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that we all are committed followers of Jesus. There are seekers amongst us. There are people in different places. And we ought to have hearts that are soft towards that as we are speaking towards each other. Jesus is pretty clearly calling us to that. In the same way, he's also calling us to discern God's intentions, right? Fascinating little quick turn here, right? He's going, don't judge. They've got a speck, you've got a plank. Don't throw pearls to pigs. Then he's like, ask, and the door will be open. Seek, knock, and the door will be open to you. It's just strange, like we're turning all over the place, and yet we're not, right? Jesus is saying all of these things because at some very clear level, how on earth are you going to discern perfectly every time, right and wrong, good and evil, when to speak to your brother or sister, how to engage them, when it's appropriate, what is pride versus humility, what is condemnation versus restoration, where are they at in their spiritual journey? Only by an intimate relationship with God. It doesn't promise that you're going to get it right all the time, but it certainly helps a whole lot, doesn't it? How do you engage your brother or your sister? Ask God. Seek God. And God welcomes. But of course, this part is not only there to show us how to pursue wisdom in these things, it's actually also there as a means of delivering the final exclamation point of the whole section, right? Is that, listen, if you ask God, he's going to give you what you need. And inherently, as followers of Jesus, we believe that to be true, right? And so Jesus says things like, hey, if you had a kid, or if you had a best friend or someone who you loved or whatever, and they asked you for bread, you wouldn't give them a stone, right? If they asked you for a fish, you wouldn't give them a snake. You'd give them what they need. How much more then your Father who is in heaven? What an incredible promise to us. But while Jesus is intending to speak truth about God to us for our own good, he's actually setting us up for his final point, isn't he? So if you know that's who God is, and if you understand that you are his representation on earth, then treat others as you would desire to be treated, right? Even our little, it's the golden rule, right? We've heard, again, another ones we've heard for forever and ever and ever. But it actually fits in this section. While it's appropriate in every single way possible, he's talking about how we engage other people, not in condemnation, but in discernment. In the same way that God gives us what we need, are you willing to give your brother or your sister what he or she needs? Right? Fully motivated by love towards restoration, not in condemnation. Treat others as you would want to be treated. Not circumstantially, but in your heart of hearts, let me put it this way, in your restored heart of hearts, in that heart of hearts that the Holy Spirit is making alive again, right? What you actually need. And what is it? Well, no one wants to be condemned. No one wants to be ostracized or isolated or called or pushed out. No one wants to have someone speak the final word over them. Instead, we want to be people who are treated with what? Grace and mercy. Inherently, we want that. Why? Because we have the image of God in us. We have connection to God. This grace and mercy thing is not just a God thing. It's part of how we're wired because we're made in his image. That's what we want inherently, and so therefore it's what you need to give to your brother or your sister. But likewise, what we want is someone who loves us enough to point out graciously and mercifully when we have or are about to really step in it. Well, you might say, no, I don't want anyone telling me what to do. In your heart of hearts, you actually do. Not simply to avoid pain, but to live in union with your Creator who has made you, which is your ultimate heart's desire. What does it mean to follow the golden rule? I think at its core it means to be people who do not condemn, instead who live in grace and in mercy, but who love our brothers and sisters in the faith, Jesus followers, enough, if, when, and where appropriate, to come alongside them and discern with them what's going on in their lives for their good and for the glory of God. Jesus says, do not worry. Subjunctive, right? You don't have to worry. Let's not worry. Totally different tense here. Do not judge. Let's not be judgmental people. Let's not be known by our condemnation. How much of the world right now would define Christians as people who are ultra-condemning? That is that way more people, especially those outside the church, know Christians for what they're against as opposed to what they're for. That is scary. Instead, let's be people who are effusive in our love, who instead of retreating from people who are other than us, actually move towards them in order to build relationships that give us opportunity to speak paths of restoration towards them because we are compelled by love, not by ego or pride or fear. This is what it means to be salt and light to those who are far from God and in this community of faith as well. You pray with me? God, as a recovering judgmental person, which means I still have a plank in my eye, forgive me for the times in which condemnation so easily rolls off my tongue and lips. Way more often in my heart and internally than spoken out loud. But you've told us all through this sermon, I'm gearing for the heart, not for the external. So, God, we do not want to be judgmental people. We don't want to condemn people because of their political stances, because of their life choices, because of even their overt sinfulness. Thank you, Jesus, that you never took the posture of condemnation. Instead, we want to be people who stand far from hypocrisy, who are vulnerable and honest about our brokenness. We are log in the eye people. But that does not eliminate us from being able to point people towards restoration. And so would you teach us? Would you show us? Would you empower us to be a community who loves each other enough to come alongside each other and discern together. To live in our spheres of influence amongst people who are at all kinds of different places in their spiritual journeys. Not blindly accepting, but intentionally loving. Earning, building the relationship that allows us to point people towards restoration. Far more in how we live and when able in how we speak. God, would it be possible that in the Lehigh Valley, when people speak or think about Hope Alliance Church, Nazareth congregation, Bethlehem congregation, and all the future congregations, they would call us, they would talk and think about us about what we're for, and not what we're against. But they would see you in your beauty and your glory because of how we order our lives and carry ourselves. That we be people of new creation and restoration, not cursing and condemnation. Ask it for your glory and for our good. Amen.